Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Glauser. I'm a program officer at the Russell Sage Foundation. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on grant writing for RSF. We'll try to go over some best practices for crafting a successful application. I'm here with my colleagues. They can introduce themselves if they want. Go ahead, guys.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Bias. I am a program associate with Russell Sage. Happy to have you.
Hello, everyone. Happy spring. My name is Deandra Durand. I'm the program assistant at the Russell Sage Foundation.
Great. So I'll just go over a couple of housekeeping notes quickly here. First is that this is being recorded, and we will be sharing it on our website probably within a couple days after this. So if you have to leave early, or if you have a colleague that missed it, you can direct them to our grant writing tips section of our website, and this will be housed there. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. That allows us to track which questions have been answered already, and then keep track in a much more easy way than if we just use the chat. And when you do ask questions, please try to keep them general. If you have specific questions about your personal project, we really encourage you to not use them in this public sphere, and instead email us at programs@rsage.org, where we can answer your question specifically. And if we don't get to your question, you can still reach out to us at that same email, which we have on the screen here, and we'll show again later. But first, a little bit of background on the Russell Sage Foundation. We've been around a long time. We're one of those I don't know, Gilded Age era foundations. We were founded by Margaret Olivia Sage for the improvement of social and living conditions in the United States. And even though it's called the Russell Sage Foundation, we're pretty sure that Russell Sage was a pretty terrible robber baron, and Margaret Olivia Sage deserves all the credit. The main thing that you have to know is that this generally has been interpreted by our trustees to mean that we fund work that is doing social science in the United States, or occasionally we do comparative work. We used to be a much larger foundation, mostly pre-Great Depression, but pretty much since World War II, we've been concentrated on social science, which most strengthening the methods, data, and theoretical core of the social sciences. Probably because funding social science and research assistance is a lot cheaper than funding huge support that we used to do, and our endowment took a hit.
All right, so nowadays we have 4 core program areas. One of the most recent ones is behavioral science and decision-making in context, which was created from combining our previous behavioral economics program with our decision-making in context program. This program area covers issues like behavioral economics, of course, but also issues around the effects of, say, biases in decision-making, or choice architecture as well. We have future of work, which handles labor economics issues usually, and some other things. We also have race, ethnicity, and immigration, and our more targeted special initiative that's also co-funded with the Carnegie Corporation of New York, entitled Immigration and Immigrant Integration. And we also have social, political, and economic inequality, which is very broad. And actually, you could say that it covers a lot of the other issues in other program areas as well. I would not be concerned with that if you're looking to apply with us and you're thinking which one to slot your project under. If you have an overlap with one, that's excellent. If you have an overlap with more than one, we really just recommend you use your best judgment and pick one. And if we feel like it's better slotted under a different program area, that's something we can change from the back end, and it won't really reflect anything with your review at all. For the next deadline, we're accepting LOIs for all of these program areas and the special initiative. And if you're interested in looking for more details, you can find them in our website at russellsage.org/programs in much more detail than I actually could give you during this webinar. So I do definitely encourage you to take a look at that website. So for our May 3rd deadline, we are accepting LOIs for research grants, which is our flagship funding program. There's 2 main tiers of funding, which can sometimes be a source of confusion for folks. So I want to address some of these issues now. There's trustee awards and presidential awards. The trustee awards have a max of $200,000 for a maximum 2-year project that is inclusive of 15% indirect. And there are presidential awards, which have a max of $50,000 with no allowed indirect. But if you're doing any kind of data collection as part of this project, surveys or anything like that, or if you're asking to fund multiple early career assistant professors, then that limit can be increased to 75 max. For both of these, the submission process is exactly the same application. The only thing that determines which one you are asking for funding under is the budget request that you put down when you fill out your application.
All right, great. So again, under this main heading of our research grant, which is the deadline that's coming up next month, I'll go over a little bit about our review process. So this is a 2-stage review submission process. The first thing you do is you submit a letter of inquiry, and that will go through an internal staff review. We do sort of the equivalent of a desk reject, and for those projects that are deemed appropriate, we move them to an external peer review. The thing to remember about peer review at the foundation, and we'll go over this more, is that it's not like a standing panel, like an NSF style panel where they are sort of locked in a room and have to review all of the LOIs. We customize each set of reviewers to each proposal. So when you do get feedback, it should be highly targeted and very helpful for your project. If your project is positively reviewed at that first external peer review stage, we will invite a full proposal. On our website, you can see the deadlines for the full proposals, and we will generally give you about a month ahead of that deadline notice to do that. So a month ahead of that proposal deadline, you will get your reviews, and then you will submit a full proposal, which instead of the 4-page letter of inquiry, a full proposal is 20 pages. It's double spaced, so it's the equivalent of 10 single space pages instead of 4 single space pages for the LOI. We will want to see you respond to the reviewer comments, and all full proposals get sent out for external review. At that point, when those reviews come in, those reviews are seen by our internally, and we occasionally will send them back to you for like a quick response memo. And all of the materials will be reviewed by our advisory committees. Each program area has a standing advisory committee that is interdisciplinary and multi-method. We have folks who are qualitative researchers, quantitative researchers, mixed methods researchers from the various social science disciplines on each of our advisory committees for each program area. And they tell us which projects should be recommended for funding or recommended to go to the board for approval. As Eric mentioned on the previous slide, anything above $75,000 has to go to our board for approval. In terms of timing, how long this will take after next month's deadline, final funding decisions for these LOIs and proposals will be made at the November Board of Trustees meeting. So the earliest grant start date for this batch would be in December 2023. Just to detail quickly another source of funding from the foundation, we have a dissertation research grants program. This is for PhD students who are basically ABD. If you're pretty much ready your proposal has been accepted by your committee, that's a good time to apply to us. This will have one deadline a year. It'll be next February for funding starting the following summer. The big things to note are that half of the funds can be for a stipend, and as opposed to our regular research grants process, it is a one-step application process. You just submit a 5-page proposal with your CV. And at the time of submission, we don't require anything like a budget.
So in addition to this, for early career scholars, specifically tenure track assistant professors, adjuncts, or teaching faculty who haven't received any kind of grant from Russell Sage in the past, we have our pipeline grants competition. These are for 1-year grants of up to $30,000, and similar to the DRG program, it's also a one-step application process, a 7-page proposal with single-spaced with a CV. There's no budget that's required at the initial stage, so it's just one one proposal, so you're good there. The interesting thing about this project or competition is that there is a mentorship component for those that are given the grant. Basically, we pair you up with a senior scholar doing research that's similar to your project that can help guide you through the project and help develop it as it continues. And all grantees are given the opportunity to present their work at a capstone conference with your cohort for the following year. You can use this grant for summer salary, data collection, research assistance, course buyouts. The guidelines are a little bit more open than it would be for our regular research awards. We have one deadline for these in November, and you can find more information, of course, on our website as well. So this slide basically just shows the difference between the pipeline grants and the research grants. Again, for pipeline, it's a one-step application process versus an LOI and proposal system like we use for research grants. For the research grants, all you really need to be eligible is just a PhD. One key instance between the pipeline grants and the research grants is that we're really looking with this particular program to diversify the social sciences and our portfolio. We want to support the next generation of social scientists in the field. So if you are from not necessarily an R1 institution, if you're first gen, I do definitely recommend that you apply for a pipeline grant if you happen to be eligible. And I mentioned the mentorship component in the capstone conference as well.
So there's a bunch of different ways that besides research grant funding that you can interact with the foundation, and we list a couple of those here. First, I'll go over our visiting fellowships programs. We have a couple. The main one is our visiting scholars program. It's generally for scholars who are a few years past their PhD and who are going to have a sabbatical. Folks come in-house. It's a residential fellowship at our foundation headquarters in New York. You get an office, and if you're from outside of New York City, you can be eligible for a subsidized apartment just about a block away from the foundation's headquarters. And it's an interdisciplinary group of folks who are all working on either papers or books, and it's sort of a great mingling of scholars every year, and it's a different cohort every year, and folks present their work to each other, get feedback from folks in their discipline, outside of their discipline, and in general, we hope that it strengthens their projects. I think everyone's favorite part about the Visiting Scholars Program is that they get you get lunch every day at the foundation, and then you get to have whatever stimulating conversations that come up there. The next deadline for that is in late June 2023, with the note that that'll be for residents in-house in 2024 and 2025. For shorter term stays, we have a visiting researchers program. That deadline is coming up next month for residents next year. And we have a visiting journalist program as well. Similarly, same deadline for residents at some point in the next year. Those stays can be as short as 1 month. They can be up to maybe 3-month stays. It's sort of like if you have some time that you need to get some work done and you have some financial support from your department already, but you just need to get out of your institution so you have maybe some headspace to work, you could apply for the visiting researcher program. We have a few summer institutes for early career scholars. These sort of rotate year on year, and it depends on the year. Some examples are we have a long-standing Summer Institute on Behavioral Economics that's been going on for a couple decades. We anticipate next year having one on proposal development, where you can sort of develop a project idea into a proposal. And we've hosted some such as migration research methods. We have past institutes that we've supported, such as those on computational social science and the biological approaches to the social sciences and social science genomics. Those deadlines are usually in the early spring for support the following summer. So we would really recommend that you sign up for our mailing list or something to see which ones are going to be available for the summer 2024, because the deadlines for this summer are already over. And then finally, we have an open access journal that is interdisciplinary, and each issue is on a different topic. And you can find out more about that at our journal's website at rsfjournal.org. And I don't know, assign the papers to your undergrads and things like that. But yeah, it's open access and interdisciplinary and peer reviewed. So this is going to be a general idea about what our reviewers do throughout almost all of our programs. So this will apply to from our dissertation research grants all the way up through our larger research grants, and even includes things like our visiting scholars program. It's reflected. It's a very similar to journal peer review. You could think of RSF program staff as sort of like the editorial staff at a journal. The main thing to remember here is that RSF staff are no longer experts at anything. We are generalists. We have to read across all of the different major social science disciplines, and we are reading quantitative research that's maybe using administrative data sets. At the same time, we are reading semi-structured interviews and qualitative work. So we really run the table of all sorts of different methods, data sets, et cetera, et cetera. So what we are primarily looking for is whether the LOIs or applications fit with RSF's programs, priorities, and various submission guidelines. And we are also generally trying to assess the appropriateness of the timing for funding. Like, is the project still too preliminary? The research design hasn't been figured out yet. The applicant is still sort of figuring it out, or it's a really good time for us as a funder to get involved, and then it can go forward. But in general, we're not experts. So we're reading generally, we're skimming it, and we're trying to figure out whether it's a good fit. But as we're reading that, we each have like a mental Rolodex of who are the people who are experts who we should ask. And as I mentioned earlier, all of the reviewers are selected specifically for their match to your project. And that could be a match topically or methodologically, or their knowledge of the data or something like that. And it's a good thing to remember that they might be interdisciplinary. So if you are an economics professor and you are submitting an econ project, it might be the case that a sociologist who's been doing work in that area for a long time may also read it. So be careful of saying things like, this is the first time anyone has ever studied it, because it might just be the first time someone in your discipline has ever studied it. But in general, we will be trying to match the reviewers to your project specifically. And then, as I mentioned earlier, each of our program areas has an advisory committee. They are standing committees of interdisciplinary experts. They are recruited specifically for their expertise in a program area. And they really help us decide which proposals after the review move forward for funding consideration. And finally, our board of trustees is similarly interdisciplinary. It's primarily made up of active academics. They are all heavy hitters in the social science research sphere. And they are the final decision makers on all proposals over 75K. And I will note that they are not a rubber stamp board. I think we have a pretty good batting average when we bring a proposal to the board. It usually gets funded, but we occasionally bring a proposal to the board and they have some questions or some concerns that, and they do reject proposals occasionally. So it is not a rubber stamp board. They are heavily involved. And you can actually see who our current board of trustees is on our website in the About Us section.
All right, so as Stephen mentioned earlier, we ask reviewers to automatically review proposals at the proposal stage, and we ask them 5 main questions during their review. And we think it's pretty important for applicants to have a sense of what we're asking so they know what to expect, essentially. So these questions are such. Are the main questions important and compelling? We want to know if the questions and/or hypotheses that you're laying out are clearly stated and are appropriately supported in terms of prior theory and empirical work. We want your project to be well motivated in whatever literature you happen to be using. If it's political science, we want you to be well versed in the political science literature on a given topic. But also, since a lot of the reviewers are interdisciplinary, we want you to take into account, say, what the economics literature might say about a given topic that you're doing research on, or what sociology would say. That being said, we want your motivation in your LOI, since it's a pretty short space to work from, to be maybe 1 page, no more than 1.5 pages. Are proposed research design, data, and methods appropriate to address the questions raised? Do you have sufficient power to make a causal claim? Of all the things that we look at in an LOI, a proposal, another application to a different program, These are the things that we look at the most: research design, data, and methods. So we really want to make sure that whatever question you're asking, the design and the methods are appropriate to actually answer that question. And we want it to be as fleshed out as it possibly can be. We want the bulk of whatever you are sending to us to really go into like a deep dive into what you're proposing to do. So say, for instance, if you're conducting a survey, what's your sampling strategy? What is significant about the place or the location that you're doing the survey, things like that. Really get into those details as much as you possibly can. In your opinion, is any additional expertise necessary to carry out the project? In other words, to gather the necessary data, conduct analyses, et cetera, et cetera. Something that investigators need to be at least aware of at the initial stage is that reviewers might consider or might suggest bringing on additional expertise for your project. Say, if you are conducting a mixed methods research project and your expertise is primarily in, I don't know, quant, not necessarily qualitative work, they might suggest you bring on a consultant or a co-PI that could also add their expertise to the project as well. What is the likely contribution of the project to the social sciences? We, as a foundation, are really concerned with advancing the literature forward in the social sciences. So we want to know exactly what you're going to contribute. Will it be in an interesting data set that other academics can use for their research? Will it result in some journal articles or a book project? And there's also a final question that is basically just to sum up anything that the other 4 questions might have missed out. So this slide is probably like the meat of the entire talk. It's really our tips and suggestions slide, do's and don'ts, what you want to include and what you do not want to include in any kind of proposal or LOI to us. First things first, we want you to make sure that the project is a fit with the foundation's funding priorities. So take a look at our website, take a look at our core funding areas, and try to make sure that your project does align with our research goals and what we're trying to do as a foundation. If you're asking for us to fund your school or actually fund your singing career, that's not likely to get funded. So please just make sure that your project is a good fit with us. We want your research questions to drive the proposal and not the data. In other words, if you have access to this really great source of data or series of sources, but you don't really have a well-developed research question or you don't have a good idea of what to do with the data, that's not necessarily something that we encourage. We want it to be the other way around. You have this great idea, this great set of questions, and then you're asking either for access to the data or are going to conduct data analysis to get to the answer to those questions. So have it be that way as opposed to the other way around. I alluded to this earlier, but we want you to balance the proposal narrative. Since you have so little space in an initial LOI to really flesh out your project, we want you to use that space as efficiently as possible. So again, for your motivation, don't go over a page. If you are adding a question or adding a column on investigator qualifications, that's not really necessarily something you need to include because we can gather a lot of this from your CV, for instance. Or we don't need another paragraph explaining why your particular project is a good fit for Russell Sage, because we can just gather that just from reading the narrative and reading your project. We want you to provide sufficient information for reviewers to evaluate whether your methods are appropriate. Again, that alludes to the same thing. Just make sure that your research design and methodology is as fleshed out as it possibly can be. We don't want you to overpromise or exaggerate what your project will do. In other words, we want your language to be appropriate for what you're trying to do. If you're doing a descriptive project, which is perfectly fine in our eyes, make sure that you don't use causal language in your proposal. Just make sure that it matches what you're trying to do. Again, if you're doing like a causal design, use appropriate causal language for that. We want you to show understanding of the strengths and limitations of the design methods and analyses that you're proposing. And if you are asked, we want you to respond to your reviews seriously, graciously, and in depth. If you are being asked to respond to reviews, this is a great opportunity to really go into the meat of what you're trying to do. Any kind of response memo, either at the LOI stage or at the proposal stage, has virtually no page limit. I say virtually because we don't want you to send 100 pages of stuff, but essentially you can really include any kind of facts, figures, or charts that you might want to really illustrate what you're trying to do. And it gives you an opportunity to really address any kind of comments that you've received from the reviewers. So just take this opportunity, be gracious, don't get a bit haughty, because sometimes that has happened in the past. And I'll also speak that sometimes you might get comments that aren't necessarily constructive. There was one instance that I remember in which someone sent back just a bunch of no's to each one of those 5 questions. And the PI that was asked to respond to these was extremely confused as to how to constructively respond to them, since the comments themselves weren't constructive. And basically, I just told the PI to use this opportunity to really delve into why they are disagreeing with the reviewer. Like, if this particular reviewer says you are not qualified, take 3 or 4 paragraphs to explain why you are qualified to conduct the project. That's what I mean by being gracious with your responses. Finally, check your website, facts. We have also example LOIs proposals on our website that we definitely recommend you take a look at, and also review all of our guidelines and deadlines. And if you are intending to submit a project to us, you do have to pre-register with our grants management portal, Flux. This registration is a manual process. There's 2 people at Russell Sage who approve these registrations. So during the week before a deadline, it can get pretty busy around here just with approving lots of these registrations. So if you are looking to apply to us, please do so in advance. Do so after this talk if you'd like to. It really takes maybe 5 minutes, and it'll speed things along greatly when you're actually starting to apply to us for funding. I also want to note one more thing, that we fund we get lots of interesting applications, and there's only so many that we can fund. We're a relatively small foundation. I think one funding round, we got maybe 700 applications and could only fund maybe less than 10% of those. So if you don't get funding the first time, learn from the reviews that you get from us. If you get reviews, and try again. And if you don't get any kind of reviews from us, feel free to send us an email, and we'll try to give you some more information onto why you didn't get passed along, or why you didn't get advanced.
And that's what I'll talk about now, is if you sort of if you got what we can call it a desk reject, it's not exactly the same, but if you did not get comments and you were declined at that initial staff screening, some of the main reasons that projects are not selected to go forward to external review are that it's not an RSF funding priority. So that could be anything like the project is not focused on the US, or certain outcomes are not a priority to the foundation. We generally don't fund things that we call routine analyses of existing publicly available data. So that's the equivalent of if you download the PSID, some data from the PSID that's freely available, and are just going to run some regressions on it. I will say on that point, if you are matching that publicly available data with some new data or something else, or proprietary data, or doing something a little bit more interesting than that, then we could still be interested in it. The best thing to do there is to sort of send us an email with like an abstract or a 1-pager describing what you're planning on doing, and just ask us if we think it would fall into this bucket. It's a good way to sort of save yourself some time. Maybe you shouldn't submit a full LOI, or then you don't have to dedicate time to submitting the full LOI if we can sort of handle it in an email. Next, we also don't fund operational support. We don't fund program evaluations. We don't fund animal studies. Things like that. And this last point in this funding priority section is a little bit hard to describe, so I hopefully will do a good job. We generally don't fund projects that focus on health outcomes or focus on various educational curricula. So on the health outcome thing, we sort of understand that as part of your project, you may be measuring health outcomes as part of a number of outcomes. You could imagine, like, we're looking at, we're doing qualitative interviews where we're asking about economic outcomes as well as mental health outcomes, or something like that. In those cases, what I would really suggest is just don't lead with the health outcomes. Lead with, like, it's one of those things where if you lead with it, the framing of the project description sort of might slant us in one way or another. It's good to just sort of lead with the outcomes that may be more of interest to the foundation. One of the reasons that we have these limits is that we're not trying to duplicate efforts of other larger foundations and other larger funders. For example, on health outcomes, there's places like NIH and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. For a lot of educational issues, there's places like the Spencer Foundation. If you're looking at a topic and are interested in various educational outcomes, the Russell Sage is more interested at the point where you're closer to entering the labor market. So if you're talking about high school graduation or college attainment and things like that, that's probably closer to an interest of Russell Sage. Whereas if you're talking about early childhood education, you'll probably get back a note that says, hey, maybe you should consider applying to the Spencer Foundation or another funder like that. The next big reason that folks get declined on the initial screen is that we've determined that the project is too preliminary. One example of this is if you're proposing to do a really expensive data collection versus you already have the data in hand and are just asking for data analysis funding. As a small foundation, we really can see our money go a lot further funding that data analyses. That doesn't mean we never fund data collection. It's just sort of like a little judgment that we make. If you're talking about on the data collection side, if you are, let's say, proposing to do a survey, but you haven't yet tested the survey instrument, we're going to call that too preliminary. We would like to see survey instruments be pre-tested. We would like to see pilot data, with the note that for both our pipeline grants competition and our dissertation research grants, we understand that folks on the earlier side of the career path are going to be doing work that is still more preliminary and may not be able to get discretionary research funds from their institution, or they may not have startup funds or something like that. And so we are a little bit more willing to look at things that are more preliminary in both the dissertation research grants and the pipeline grants competition. But in general, we want to see that you have a well-developed research design. And if we don't think it's quite developed enough, we might reject you for being too preliminary. And that doesn't mean we won't ever be interested in your project. It just means that we think at this time you have some more thinking to do. And then there's a sort of a mixed bag of other reasons that folks get declined. Sometimes it's just a lack of clarity in the LOI. There are basic design flaws that we see in the LOI, like the data or methods are not well suited for the research being proposed. And occasionally, this also happens where we just get poorly written LOIs that were clearly sort of rushed last minute because maybe the applicant found out that the deadline was that day and really just tried to throw something together, or they procrastinated too long, which I think everyone in academia knows what that's like. Also, we occasionally see things that are clearly, this was a proposal that was written for NSF and you just copied and pasted it over to us, and we could tell. So it's like you didn't read our website, you didn't read our guidelines, you're including a whole bunch of things that we may not care about. So yeah, those are sort of, sometimes we even get LOIs that only send us like 2 pages, or they completely ignore the page limit and send us way too many pages. And so those are various reasons. And then finally, we do prioritize research with really strong descriptive or causal designs. This is on that earlier slide when Eric was talking about like tips for what to include. We want you to spend the most space in your LOI on your research design. The more details you have on your data, your methods, your analytic plan, and why those are the appropriate way to answer the research questions that you're posing, then you would have a stronger submission. I'll talk a little bit about the budget guidelines. And again, if you have specific questions about your project, I would recommend emailing us rather than talking about it in the Q&A. But generally for the research grants, the larger research grants, a full budget is not needed at the LOI stage. We just need a brief description of what you're going to spend. And indeed, I would say don't waste a lot of space, because that space you could be spending on your research design. So if you just tell us, I need $75,000 for summer salary, research assistance, and access to this data set. That would be plenty of information at the LOI stage. For both the dissertation research grants program and the pipeline grants program, we don't require a budget at the submission stage. Similarly, we just want a brief description. If you are a very high salary individual, this is usually folks at like business schools or econ departments or something like that. If you have over $250,000 salary, you are not eligible for summer salary. But if you're below that, you can have up to $25K for a 1-year grant or $50K for a 2-year grant. Course buyouts are only considered on a case-by-case basis. We will be asking you like what your teaching load is or something like that, but they are allowed for pipeline grants. We love funding research assistance, and so student research assistance is encouraged, but we do not pay for tuition. And crowdsourced workers, like if you're using Mechanical Turk, must be paid the minimum wage where you are, or $15 an hour, whichever is higher. And then finally, for our regular research grants, travel for dissemination and conferences is not allowed, but travel for data collection is allowed. If you're a pipeline grant applicant, we do allow some funding for dissemination and conferences. All of these and many, many more can be found at our website on our budget page. And I encourage you to reach out with any questions you have before applying. If you want to know if a certain purchasing of a data set or transcription cost should count or anything like that, just shoot us an email and we can let you know what's generally allowed.
Between the both of us, we've given this talk quite a few number of times. So there have been a number of other things that have been kind of important to point out, but don't really fit anywhere else in the talk, so I'll include them here. We recommend that you definitely use your networks. Talk to people in your department. Even, I don't know how useful this would be nowadays with the antics of a certain billionaire, but engage your network on academic Twitter. Chances are someone in your network has tried to get a grant from us in the past or has gotten a grant from the past from Russell Sage, and that would be an excellent resource to ask them questions about what their experience was like, their pointers. It's a really great resource to use. So I definitely recommend that you use your networks as much as possible. Similarly, we want you to get your Office of Sponsored Projects at your university involved as early as you possibly can, just because bureaucracy takes kind of a bit of a long time to get started. We don't need, in many cases, for you to send official documents with an application yet. That's certainly true in the case of the DRG program and the pipeline program, and even actually our research grants program. But when we do start requiring these things, we want you to have engaged your Office of Sponsored Projects as early as possible so that they know what to expect. We want you to think about your budget, know what your research is worth. I can give an example of someone sending an application for far less than the limit was, maybe like $10,000 for a project. And we had to go up to them later in the process and be like, hey, would you like to increase your survey size? Would you like to add some funds to hire another RA perhaps? There's like a sweet spot in which we want you to be able to conduct your project as effectively as possible, but it's not necessarily more attractive to us to aim lower than you need to. So just take that into consideration when you're looking over the budget guidelines. And finally, program staff like me, Stephen, and Deandra are a resource both before and after an application. We really pride ourselves on being as transparent as possible with the process. If you have a question, we will answer it. If you have an abstract or a one-pager that you're not exactly sure would fit with Russell Sage, but you're kind of on the fence, send it to us at programs@rsage.org. We'll take a look at it. We'll give our pointers. Yeah, we don't want to waste your time if you're sending something to us that in the end won't get funded. So we'll try to accommodate you and give you as much information as possible. And similarly, if you've sent us an application that ended up not getting funded and you didn't get comments back, reach out to us. We'll try to investigate and give you a bit more information as we possibly can. And with that note, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, programs@rsage.org is the best way to get in touch with us. All three of us monitor that email constantly. So we definitely recommend that you have any kind of question, any kind of pointer, or actually any kind of concern, just email us there. And from this point on, we will take any kind of questions that you send us through the Q&A function of Zoom. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. And I will just add one thing, which is that the closer you get to the deadline, the harder it is for us to answer your email. So get to us sooner rather than later. You know how everyone procrastinates. And so if you're emailing us the day before the deadline, we're going to struggle to respond to you. But if you're emailing us a week or two ahead of the deadline, we might even be able to set up a Zoom call with you or something like that. But yeah, thank you for joining us. And I know Deandra has been answering some of the questions as they came up in the chat, but feel free to jump in there and send us anything else. And if you have specific questions about your project and how well it might fit with the foundation, please send it to programs@rsh.org. All right, I think we're pretty good, Eric, if you want to cut it. Looks like Deandra's been doing a pretty good job keeping up with the questions in the chat.
Okay, thanks everybody.